Okay, Sully's on the couch, and I assume you're ready, and I guess I'm ready. So here we go. I'm Ms. Collier, and on this episode of the Tortilla Cat Files, we're going to talk about the causes of the American Civil War. The easy answer that everybody says is slavery caused the Civil War, and slavery was a big factor in a lot of ways, but it's not the only factor. It kind of is like the straws that finally break the camel's back, lots of little things, and then that's it. Everybody's done. So let me share my screen here for you with my mad technical skills. And we'll start that. We'll click that again, and there we go. Okay, so the causes of the American Civil War. The first big thing was the economic situation in the country. We had been a nation of our own for not quite 100 years. Good morning, Scout. How are you? And there'd already started to be this divide in the way the country looked at things and the way the country dealt with things. Okay, so Scout's on the table. So if you see what looks like an earthquake, it's just Scout rubbing on the computer because she feels like she has to do that. In the north, there was a larger population. There was more densely populated, more people in the north, and there were more urban areas, more cities in the north that were, bigger cities. And they were, don't stand on that. Okay, they were beginning to embrace the Industrial Revolution, and factories were beginning to develop. In the South, the population was mostly rural. It was mostly like country areas. Agriculture was a huge driving factor in the South. And the way that it was set up was that not everybody, because, there were poor people in the South too, but the wealthier people and most of the truly wealthy people, a lot of them lived in the South just because of the way the system was set up, that they had large, what they called plantations, which were these huge farms, and they had to be run by slaves. They mostly grew cotton and tobacco, which were cash crops, which they then sold to make money. They did not raise their own food generally. They bought their own food. They bought their food because they'd a whole lot rather spend their money, use their land and their labor to grow stuff that's going to make them money, that then they turn around and they buy food. In the north, agriculture was mainly small farms where people grew their own food. And so they had a much more diversified, which means lots of different pieces to it, economy. The South, they had agriculture. What they didn't realize at that point, although some of them must have been bound to be noticing it, was that every time they planted cotton or tobacco, it took nutrients out of the soil. And nutrients are what the plants needed to grow. And so every time they plant cotton, then the next time they plant cotton, they're probably going to get a little bit less and a little bit less because they didn't know about fertilizing. And so they weren't replacing the nutrients back in the soil, and they weren't rotating their crops and planting something that's going to be not a cash crop necessarily, but it's going to replace the nutrients in the soil. So in a lot of ways, this system was probably already buckling and beginning to be on the verge of failing just because they didn't know the science of what they were doing. But it was going to take a while probably for that to happen. Okay, territorial expansion. You remember we talked about at some point the Louisiana Purchase, or Louisiana if you're not from Texas, and the United States had now acquired a whole lot more land. And this land needed to be developed and people put into it. Well, the people in the North did not want slavery to expand into that new territory. A lot of those people, not everybody. That's because slavery was still allowed in some places in the North, but in a lot of the places in the North, good morning, Bass, it was not allowed. It was illegal. Hi, Esther. And the people in the South were determined that they were going to move into some of this territory, because remember, they're using up their land and they need bigger and bigger pieces of land, and more people are wanting to become plantation owners, and there's only so much land, so you got to go someplace else to get some more. And they are determined that they're going to take slavery with them into these new territories. So there's this big fight between yes, I want to, and no, you're not going to, kind of a situation. So in 1820, they came up with the Missouri Compromise. Now, a compromise means that there's one side that wants this, and there's another side that wants this. And in a really good compromise, neither one of them are happy. Because in a really good compromise, this side has to give up something and this side has to give up something, and they make something new that neither one of them really wanted, but they both decide they can live with. If you have a compromise and one side is completely happy or the other side is completely happy, you don't have a compromise. You have this, but you had a fight and somebody won. That's not really a compromise. The Missouri Compromise said that the state of Missouri would be admitted into the United States as a slave state. And then the state of Maine would be admitted. Maine was at that point still part of Massachusetts, and they didn't want to be part of Massachusetts anymore. And they would be admitted as a free state, so it would be balanced, because at that point there were, I think it was 11 slave states and 11 free states, and they kind of, were balanced out. And neither side wanted to give an advantage to the other side. So, and the Missouri Compromise also said that slavery would be illegal in the new territories that were north of Missouri's southern border. And this was kind of a weird compromise and sort of a made-up deal, but it held for a good long time. It's for several decades. The next big challenge they had came in 1854, when Kansas and Nebraska were both set to come into the United States, but they were kind of in weird places, and hey, knock that nonsense off, cats. There's plenty of food, just take turns, you're fine. Anyway, so the decision was made that instead of, one of them coming in as a free state and one of them coming in as a slave state, they would be, the populations of the state would be allowed to vote on whether they wanted to be slave or free. Nebraska decided that they were going to be a free state. Kansas was now the big battleground. And people in Kansas went nuts. People around Kansas went nuts. And people were moving into Kansas from all over everywhere, men, because they were the only ones that could vote, and voting, so that when the vote was taken finally in Kansas, it was like 7,000 more people than actually lived in Kansas had voted in this election. You want to talk about election fraud? Here it is, baby. Violence broke out. It was horrible. People were setting fire to other people's houses. People were killing each other. It was a horrible, horrible business that was referred to as bleeding Kansas. So things are not going well for the Union of the United States at this point, because nobody can agree on anything. States' rights were also a big issue, particularly in the South. Now, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, which we've studied, that the 10th Amendment says that all powers that are not specifically given to the United States government are reserved to the states. So at least especially in the South, that meant to them that the state government was actually stronger than the federal government. And the Southerners pretty much believed that the United States government didn't have the right to tell them what to do pretty much about anything at all. And especially, they didn't have the right to attempt to abolish slavery. And abolish means get rid of and make illegal, make it where it can't happen at all. It went so far that at some point, and I didn't write the year down, so I'm sorry, the Senate actually voted that the Southerners pushed through the idea that in the Senate, slavery couldn't even be brought up and discussed. the abolition of slavery could not even be brought up and discussed unless the whole group voted that they would do that, and they were never going to vote that they would do that. So, I mean, things are starting to get really ugly about this. Okay. Then you also have the formation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party started to form sometime in around the 1850s. And it was forming to take over from the Whig Party. The Whig Party was dying out, and the Republican Party began to form. Many of the members, but not all, were abolitionists from the North, and abolitionists wanted slavery to be abolished or made illegal. And the Southerners believed that the only reason this party was forming was that its goal was to abolish slavery, and that's all it meant to do. It didn't mean to do anything else. It was just against slavery. Now, we have the Republican Party today, but the views of the Republican Party in this time were not the same as the views of the Republican Party today. At some point, the Republican and Democrat parties kind of switched, and so the arguments for what the Republican Party was arguing then would be more like what the Democratic Party is arguing now. It's a weird situation, and maybe we'll look at why that happened at some point later on. So the formation of the Republican Party was another problem for the South. And we were talking about, it's like a pan balance where you're putting more stuff into one side, or the camel's back where you're putting more straws onto it, and eventually you put that one last little straw, and that's the one that makes the camel's back break. So that's what we're beginning to look at here. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was also another big problem. It was a law that required that any escaped slave must be returned to their owners, even if that slave were now in a free state. So it made all of the states responsible for policing slavery. Whether they were a slave state or not, they had to be watching out for escaped slaves, and if they found them, they had to arrest them and send them back to their owners. Now, the people in the North, most of them were against this whole idea. They didn't want to be involved in this, and so this helps spark the formation of the Underground Railroad, a lot of which was designed to get these fugitive slaves out of the United States and into Canada, where they could not be returned because Canada wasn't going to go with that. And so that way those people could be free, or to get them out into a place where there was no law so that they could live a free life. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that was written by a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she was an abolitionist. She believed that slavery should be abolished. This was serialized in newspapers. When we talk about it being serialized, it's kind of like the way that shows are streamed in a lot of cases now. You watch a show on Netflix or Disney or something, and it's a new show, and you get one episode this week, and you have to wait till next week to get the next episode, and it drives us crazy because we don't want to just watch all of it at one time. That's what these stories were that were serialized in the newspapers. They would print like the first chapter in the newspaper one week, and then next week you get the next chapter, and it would go on like that for a long time, and you'd have to get all of the newspapers to be able to read the whole story. So it was serialized in newspapers in 1851. It was published as an actual book in 1852, and it was written to show the evils of slavery, how the slaves were badly treated, how the masters would hunt runaway slaves with dogs, how they were whipped by the overseers, things that probably did go on while we know that they went on. And this may be the first time that people in the North know about this. It was a huge bestseller in the North. It didn't sell so well in the South. And it helped to boost people's feelings of supporting abolitionism. This was one of the big turning points that to the point that after the Civil War started and Harriet Beecher Stowe actually met Abraham Lincoln, who was the president, and he made the comment of, "You're the little lady who started this big war." The Dred Scott decision. Let me move me so you can see poor Dred Scott's head. over Miss Collins. That is not Dred Scott. That was Roger Taney, and I skipped that. I'm sorry, I took the picture of Dred Scott off of there. Sorry about that. Okay. Did I skip the whole thing? I did. Huh, okay. Technical skills, mad technical skills. Sorry about that. So Dred Scott was a man who was born into slavery. In 1832, he was purchased by Dr. John Emerson, who was an army surgeon who traveled around the country a lot because he was in the army, so he got moved into different places. Dred Scott went with him and lived in Illinois for a time, and Illinois was a free state, and lived for a time in the Wisconsin Territory, which was not a state yet, but slavery was illegal in the Wisconsin Territory under the Missouri Compromise. Remember, we talked about the Missouri Compromise. In 1843, Dr. Emerson died, and ownership of Dred Scott and his wife passed to Emerson's widow, whose name was Irene. She moved back to Missouri, which was a slave state, and at that point in 1846, Dred Scott brought sued her in a court saying that, he had lived in Wisconsin for a long time and slavery was illegal there. And that meant that he was a free person and he could not be re-enslaved. Sounds legitimate. The case was, settled in various courts. And what happens was a case gets settled in a court and one side or the other doesn't like it. And so they will appeal to the next court up the chain and appeal to the next court up the chain. And finally, some cases make it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the nation. And when they settle something, it should be settled. So in 1854, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear this case. They don't have to hear every case. They decide what they're going to hear. And the Supreme Court, whose name was Roger Taney, Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney, that's this guy right here, wrote the decision. It was a split decision, but the majority believed what Taney wrote about. And so what their decision was that people of African descent, so people who were Black people, whether they were free people or enslaved people, were not citizens of the United States. Even if they had been born here, they were not citizens. And therefore, they had no rights under the Constitution. And so Dred Scott couldn't legally bring a suit to say he was even entitled to be free. He also wrote that the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution protected the slaves' owners' rights because these people were their property and property could not be taken without due course of law. This is a horrible decision. The fact that it makes it where no Black people have citizenship in the United States, and believe me, that is not true still today. But arguably, most people believe this right here is the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made. So keep that in mind. This is where we are now. Okay. And then there was the raid on Harpers Ferry. I'll put myself right there. We'll go down here. The raid on Harpers Ferry on October the 16th in 1859. This is John Brown. This is his portrait from the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And he sort of looks a little crazy. He got the crazy looking eyes there, but be that as it may, he was an abolitionist. He had actually been part of the Bleeding Kansas situation. He had fought to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state. He and a group of other people attacked the Federal Arsenal, which is a place where military arms, guns, and ammunition were stored at Harpers Ferry in Virginia. It's believed that he wanted to steal these guns and give them to slaves to start a slave revolt so that the slaves could free themselves. He was arrested by Lieutenant Robert E. Lee, who we'll hear about later, and a group of Marines before they got very far from the Harpers Ferry. He was convicted of treason in Virginia and hanged, and he became a martyr to the Northern abolitionists. I mean, they had songs that they sang about John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his truth goes marching on. So the lyrics from the one song I can remember hearing about. I am not going to sing it. Oh, good Lord, no. They don't pay me enough to sing, and they don't pay you enough to listen. But this was another one of the situations that, people in the South were terrified of slave revolts because, let's be honest, the slaves outnumbered the whites by a lot. If this had ever actually happened, slavery would have probably been over very quickly. And then the final straw came in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Remember, he was part of the Republican Party, and he was elected president on November the 6th of 1860. He hadn't even taken office yet, because in those days, you didn't take office as the president until sometime in March. Now we've changed it, and it's in January. But, it was still months before he was going to take office. He hadn't done anything yet. And he had said all along that he didn't believe that slavery should be allowed, but it was allowed, and he couldn't see that they should get rid of it completely. He had been not said anything really all that provocative to the South, but they were convinced, the people in the South were convinced that was it. They were going to abolish slavery. We're done with this. And so on December 20th of 1860, before Abraham Lincoln's even gotten to Washington, D.C., he hasn't even begun to take office yet, the state of South Carolina voted to secede or withdraw and leave the Union. That set off a chain of events which led to the Civil War. So let's end that. So that's where we are. Those are the facts I can find and give you in this short time period. It's a very complicated situation, and you'll have to decide for yourself what you think is the main cause of the Civil War. But it's all intertwined with people's ways of life, the way people make money, and people's beliefs on slavery is a huge part of that. So there we are. It's not a very happy subject this time. I'll try to do something fun, a little more fun so you can have something happy to listen to. A lot of history is not happy. If you want to read more about this, talk to your school librarian, talk to your librarian in your town. They will be happy to help you. That's what librarians like to do. Scout is saying goodbye up there in the top. Okay, I guess that's everything we have for you today. So if you like this, give me a comment, subscribe if you like it. Let me know what you'd like to hear about the next time. All right, Sully, I guess we're done. See you next time.